My name is Christoph Hochhäusler, and I am here to introduce my friend Marco Abel. Before I start, let me begin with an anecdote about me, because isn't that the running joke of all introductions, that the speakers would rather talk about themselves, but must hide this desire with fake humility? I will try to meet this standard. But first, the anecdote. In my second film, Falscher Bekenner, the US title is I Am Guilty, which was not my choice, by the way. Attention, that's the anecdote already. So in this film, there's a scene where David Striso, the German actor, who's probably the record holder in the films per year quota, a great talent, he improvised over a line of dialogue I had written. The scene is about a family gathering, a conversation around the living room table that concerns a house painter who hires youngsters, punks, vandals to spray and tag houses in order to land more contracts for paint jobs. Bringing one of the themes of the film to the fore, the forbidden romance between effect and cause. Forbidden because of the wrong order. Effects searching for a cause, effects without a cause, dots hoping to get connected, longing for a story. And David then said, off the script, but on point, that this is like in academia. You create a problem to sell your answer. At the time, I thought this brand of anti-intellectualism is a bit out of character. But he delivered the line with ease, and I liked the take overall, a very long take. So we kept it in the film. And over the years, in the strange case of becoming an object of study, I had to think of this line time and again. And no other than Marco is to blame for this. Marco contacted me, I looked it up, via email, December 27th, 2005, just after midnight. At the time, he was an assistant professor in Lincoln, Nebraska, a state I was not even sure existed. And I've got to tell you that after visiting Marco there in 2007, I'm even less sure that it exists. But that's another story. Anyway, in this email, he sketched out a research project on what around that time began to be called Berlin School, a band of outsiders, a counter-cinema, as Marco eloquently argues in his book, The Counter-Cinema of the Berlin School, published 2013. And this group, that sometimes denies to be a group, by the way, but is, I'd say, more than the sum of its members, is the topic of his major book. And now for those of you who are not in academia, is there anyone actually? 1.5 maybe. You have to understand that it's quite a bet to write a book about something that is not yet recognized as a problem. As it was the case for the Berlin School at the time, contrary to common belief, to be first in academia is a big disadvantage, usually. Because what if you write long hours, months, years, almost 6 years in this case, and no one jumps on the train? Chances are you're going to Nebraska, metaphorically speaking. Well, Marco did stay in Lincoln, Nebraska, but his book put him on the map, and to a certain degree put the Berlin School on the map with him. Any which way, the book was a big success, won tons of awards, including the prestigious German Studies Association DAAD Book Prize, they should change this name, and got rave reviews. So to counterbalance my silly Nebraska bashing from before, Marco, again speaking metaphorically, proved that Lincoln, Nebraska is not only the geographical center of the US, it really is, unless you want to include Alaska and Hawaii in the equation, but also one of the centers of German film studies in the US, and that's quite a feat. Coming back to the formula, creating problems to sell your answer. Through Marco's groundbreaking work on the films of the Berlin School, I became his problem. He practically invented me. Now, if this sounds like complaining, in all fairness, I have to admit, he made me a problem, yes, but he had the decency to solve me, too. I'm not sure what's worse, actually. On a more serious note, artists are trying to create works that mirror time in society, objects that may be used to measure the human condition without necessarily letting the audience feel this weight. I know we are in Germany, but still. For me, filmmaking, cinema, is about seduction. It's about seducing the spectator to an attentiveness that breaks their daily routines, their worn-out self-image. Now, this might surprise you, but artists are humans too. They need to break the same routines. That's why it's a great privilege, a chance and challenge, if your work is not only seen, but reflected. If there's someone to hold the mirror to your mirror. And that is why I'm deeply grateful for you, Marco, holding up the mirror to us, to our cinema. Of course, you know what happens when you hold a mirror to the mirror. You get infinite answers about you and you and you and you. It's wonderful. But I'm talking too much about me. Marco, born in Cologne, spent just enough time in the US to acquire an American accent when speaking German, which comes handy when interviewing German filmmakers who usually consider Hollywood to be the sun in the solar system of cinema. You guessed right, Paris is the moon. If you now wonder what planet we are on, and if there is life to be found in this distant corner of the cinematic universe, aka German cinema, ask Marco, or even better, listen to him. Marco, please come on stage.
Well, thanks so much, Christoph, for this wonderful, kind introduction. I can honestly say, I mean, like, I do believe sort of in these odd coincidences that are social coincidences where you get to meet some people and you don't know how important they will become in your life. And we have a few people here in this room about whom I can say this. Christoph being one of them, because he has been very generous to me in terms of connecting me with a lot of filmmakers. I've interviewed him twice that we published, and I wouldn't have done all the work on the Berlin School, for example, without him. But the origin of my interest in the Berlin School sits actually there. My friend Mark once sent me 10 DVDs to Lincoln, Nebraska, and there were some, Christoph's film was in there, and Christian Petzold film was in there, and so on. I would have never known about these films had it not been for the gift of that sort of care package from Germany. Likewise, my good friend Christian here has housed me many times in Berlin as I was sort of starting to find my bearing in Berlin, coming for the Berlin Film Festival every year. And it was always, you know, as you can imagine, I didn't have that much money, so I was staying in sort of like, you know, pretty bare bones kind of hostels and whatnot, and Christian was very kind at the time with his family to take me in. And then over the years also always provided good company while I was here. Christoph Wahl is somewhere here also. Where are you, Christoph? Right there. Also professor here at the Potsdam Film University. Also an important interlocutor over the years. We did the Dominik Graf book together. Michael Wedel is here also as one of the co-editors. So these are sort of wonderful, like, you know, like that wasn't planned. I didn't plan to write on the Berlin School. That wouldn't have happened without the gift of friendship also then subsequently. And so in this spirit, I started to think about a new project, and oddly enough, this is once again sort of a group of filmmakers called the New Munich Group from the mid to late 60s. And it has something to do with yet another friend, where's Bernhard, somewhere here also, right there, who introduced me to them through his own enthusiasm about those films. And he knows some of those filmmakers, and as a result of this, I was able to interview those filmmakers. And over the years, I've come to really enjoy talking with the filmmakers, and you know, so as a primary way of researching sort of like a topic to get off the ground. I won't talk about the New Munich Group today, but thanks to the Academy and thanks to being a Dirk Eppen Fellow, I was able to, some months ago, 5 weeks ago, to talk with a German publisher. And in my conversation about a different project, he asked, what else are you doing? And I started talking about the New Munich Group. And within a week, I had a book contract about the New Munich Group. And so, yeah, you know, it's like lucky. It was great. And the Newman Group's sort of the project that I applied for here, the Newman Group is sort of part of it, but it's not the primary point of the project. And so I have, however, sort of switched in my time here now attention, since I have a book contract and I gotta get this project done. But it wouldn't have happened, I think, without being here and being able to talk with people, right? Like, and having that interaction, and you make a connection, and you sort of show your enthusiasm for something, and they pick up on this, and then they go for it. So I'm very grateful to the Academy for giving me this wonderful fellowship. It's a real gift. It's a real present. And I want to thank, of course, all the staff, like all my fellow fellows who have spoken before me, emphasize this. We cannot emphasize this enough. We are privileged to be here. They work hard, and we get excellent food and endless wine and wonderful housing. You know, it's like, what do you want? It's like 4.5 months of your paradise. But then finally, in terms of my preliminary remarks, I want to thank my wife and partner in crime, Joy Castro, without whom I would not be here, because Joy told me I should apply for this fellowship. And I said, it's like, no, I don't have, I'm in a department. I have 170 people to manage. It's like, I don't have a project right now. And she insisted and kept twisting my arm in very subtle ways. And before I knew it, I was then sort of cooking up a project, more or less from scratch, sort of taking some bits and pieces of things that I've been thinking about. And so thank you, Joy, for making this happen. And, you know, we have had a wonderful full time here. So the project that I'm talking about today, I should say this is really at the beginning. I'm trying to find my way into the project. This is not a project that's done. I'm not necessarily knowing where I'm going. I don't even know whether the project works. So this is sort of like a first stab at this. The larger hope is perhaps to sort of reimagine or retell the story of something like the political cinema in Germany from the mid-60s to the present. I am interested in the present ultimately, but I think that something is going on in the present that can be explained by going back to that time period and create a certain kind of story about this. I think the story will not be agreeable to everyone, including some of the experts in this room, but that's okay. I think that's where it gets interesting, right? Like if everyone agrees, then it's sort of boring. So, having spent the last 15 years researching German post-unification cinema, especially the filmmakers of the so-called Berlin School, I've become increasingly interested in how political cinema has been configured in the context of German film history, not least in relation to the question of what was left, which Andreas Christoph Schmidt raised in his 2003 made-for-television essay film. You can find that on YouTube. It's quite interesting. Undoubtedly, simply put, two options seem to be in play today. First, films made in the avant-garde tradition of difficult films that intentionally seek to assault viewers' senses and intellect, that in their desire to be transgressive resist viewers' desire for easy consumption, and that are often didactic or pedagogical. These films mostly screen at film festivals, in museums, or galleries. Second, the tradition of thematic films that deal with big, weighty issues such as Germany's totalitarian pasts or terrorism, but also with topics of the day such as, say, the resurgence of the far right and the status of refugees in post-war Germany. These films occupy primetime television slots and occasionally find themselves nominated for Academy Awards, to my chagrin. The lives of others. Films that fall into neither of these two categories, such as those I discussed in the counter-cinema of the Berlin School, are often not considered political. I think this has to do with how the notion of the political circulates, not only in German cinema, but also in post-unification culture at large. For example, most, though certainly not all, critics tend to have recourse, implicitly or explicitly, consciously or not, to a model of political filmmaking that stems from the late 60s and early 70s, a model that in turn has its roots in the revolts of the long 1968 and its attendant dominant left political cinematic expressions. To me, this is a mistake both conceptually and politically. Suspicious of this dominant film historiographical and film theoretical conception of the political film, my goal is to revisit the question of the political film as it has played itself out in West German and then post-unification German film culture from the watershed moment of the Oberhausen Manifesto from 1962 to the present. Trying to nuance this dominant conception of the political film, my revisionist historiographical project, tentatively titled Left Politics Without Leftism, a counter-genealogy of Germany's political cinema. And I suspect it won't stay that way because Joy doesn't like the title and I have to listen to her, so like eventually I have to come up with something better. Is grounded in a number of theorists of the moving image and of politics and of the left that are rarely used in German film studies, such as Gilles Deleuze, Jacques Rancière, and South Korean German philosopher Byung-Chul Han. The first two have much to say about the connection of left politics and aesthetics, and the latter offers a provocative way of reframing debates about recent political history by linking them to the question of violence, a question that I addressed in my first book, Violent Affect. The starting point for my new project emerged from three seemingly disconnected moments in my research. First, oddly enough, a film that I feel very ambivalent about, but still thinking through Hans Weingartner's 2004 film, Die fetten Jahre sind vorbei, or The Educators, for an essay that I co-published some years ago. Two, revisiting the mostly forgotten film critical debate about the so-called aesthetic left that took place in West Germany around '68 and its relation to the New Munich group of filmmakers. And third, discovering Johannes Schaaf's 1967 film Tätowierung or Tattoo, which, as I hope to demonstrate this evening, diagnosed then emerging political developments in remarkably prescient ways that nevertheless remained opaque to the political left at the time. And here I should as an aside again say, I discovered this film at the Moving History Film Festival in Potsdam in 2017, which is organized by Ilka Brombach, who is here somewhere, and Chris Wahl. I didn't know about the film, and I was quite taken by the film. I thought it was fantastic, and I started writing a little bit about this. So again, a good sort of a wonderful coincidence in that regard. Today's presentation is about the last two moments, though primarily about the third. Let me just say in passing that my interest in The Educators has to do with the fact that it dramatized at the beginning of the millennium a question that still seems to resonate today. What can we do when everything we tried failed? A question triggered at the time by a sense that we do not know what to do in response to processes that seem to swallow up all forms of resistance by simply turning such resistance into something that can be commodified. The Educators not only offers its own response in form of a rather unusual, I called it viral, political action, but also prompts its audience to ask what they think left politics is today, a question that quickly assumes a historical quality precisely because it has to be historicized. What is left politics today cannot be severed from the historical question of what left politics was in the past, and here in 1968 would seem to be the historical watershed moment that the film wants to address. So it is in this context that Tattoo strikes me as an interesting starting point for revisiting '68 and the question of the political, including political cinema, not least since it engages the question of violence in a striking manner precisely because it links it to the affect of joy, which, like violence, was of great importance to '68. Simply put, a Tätowierung or a tattoo is the outcome of an act of violence, namely of an instrument breaching the skin in order to leave its mark on the body upon which it impinges. Yet this act of violence is inscribed with joy, with the joy of violence, we might say, in that the one getting the tattoo usually takes pleasure in the result of this violence, if not in the actual experience thereof. Conversely, a recipient of a tattoo may not take pleasure in being tattooed or its outcome if they are involuntarily subjected to such an act. Yet those subjecting someone to this particular act of violence may very well take great joy in impinging upon another's body. In either scenario, however, a significant transformation is effected through the act of tattooing. Tattooing, then, could be considered an interruption of or an eruption from within the normal flow of things, an event of sorts, the effects of which tend to be long-lasting, though not necessarily visible. Without ascribing any intentionality with regard to this parsing of tattooing to Johannes Schaaf, I want to suggest that his film can be seen as having tattooed its own socio-political moment in the sense I just delineated. And although this sense might have become intellectually available only due to the benefit of historical distance, I submit that it did in fact register and leave a mark, however circuitously, in the context of what was arguably one of the most crucial, polemical, and divisive film critical debates of the time in West Germany. This debate was triggered by the well-known West German film critic Enno Patalas. Here are sort of the German originals, but I'm going to read the English translations to you. But many of you obviously speak German and understand German. In his 1966 essay, Plädoyer für die ästhetische Linke, Plea for the Aesthetic Left, Patalas polemically juxtaposed what he characterized as a primarily sociologically oriented political left film criticism, which today is no longer able to comprehend the most important films, and an aesthetic left film criticism, which in Patalas' view is capable of freeing the gaze of the viewer from conventional beliefs that block his access to what his eyes meet. Patalas claimed that the aesthetic left criticism he favored has as its goal not to bring in line the consciousness of the reader with that of the critic, but to provoke him or her to independent reflection on the work. This essay, the first occasion in which the terms political and aesthetic left were introduced into West German film culture, triggered a series of replies, some supportive of and many angrily opposed to Patalas' provocation. And it should be said that Patalas himself was already responding to an ongoing conversation as well in the journal Film Kritik. 2.5 years later, and that's where these quotes are from, Patalas doubled down on his argument. In Die Toten Augen, literally the dead eyes, Patalas, with recourse to Herbert Marcuse, accuses the political left of favoring an excessive rationalism that he characterizes as misogyny, an unusual claim for a male critic to make at the time. Discussing the political left's films, including Alexander Kluge's just-released second feature, Die Artisten in der Zirkuskuppel ratlos, the artists in the circus dome clueless from 1968, he argues that in those films, rationality as male privilege clearly functions as a means of repression and expresses fear of the claims of the senses. The consequence, Patalas holds, is that these films and the corresponding critical practice imprison their and our senses by tying them up with the rope of reason. By doing so, Patalas argues the political left ends up denying the freedom of play and ultimately imagine utopia not as a concrete counter-design that demands realization and that yields a net gain in pleasure, but as a function of the existing, of work, or of asceticism. Just for good measure, Patalas concludes what in my view is one of the most crucial film critical essays of the time, one that isn't appreciated enough as an articulation of a rich theoretical position, by positing that the filmmakers and critics he's debating do not consider the cinema as a promise of happiness in the here and now, as the rendering sensible of better possibilities in the concrete, not as a school of our capacities to recognize such possibilities, which is why their eyes are dead and their films look like it, as he put it. Good times, right? So, this film critical debate had, I think, its pendant on the level of the very films that were made in West Germany around '68. Patalas and fellow aesthetic left critics were among the few who detected in a certain kind of emerging filmmaking which self-consciously positioned itself against what was gradually in the process of becoming the dominant mode of left political filmmaking in the years following the famous Oberhausen Manifesto, the potential for transformation, for a redistribution of the sensible, that is, of what could be sensed and made sense of what could be seen and what could be perceived around '68. In a way, we might think of the aesthetic left both on the level of filmmaking, as it was associated with the largely unknown films by the New Munich group around directors such as Klaus Lemke and Rudolf Thomé, and on the level of film criticism as practiced by Patalas, Frieda Grafe, and others, as a tattoo that breached the sociologizing and often moralizing left political film critical and filmmaking discourse of the time. The aesthetic left disrupted, might we say, did violence to the existing distribution of the sensible. And in so doing, it rendered sensible something else, something new and still emerging that remained largely incomprehensible at the time, but that nevertheless was already inscribed in this eruptive moment. The mark the aesthetic left tattooed from within the larger left onto its body did apparently enough violence to the sensibilities of the established political left for the latter to feel compelled not only to vigorously push back against the aesthetic left's intervention, but also to shape West German film historiography so that this tattoo would largely be erased from German film and film critical history. So, for example, one can demonstrate when one looks at some of the major books of German film history of how, say, the New Munich group has been written out from a moment when they were still present to later editions of the same book where they're no longer present. And then one has to ask who's writing these histories, right? And then it becomes interesting for me. In Left Politics Without Leftism, I want to show how this moment around 68 codified at considerable cost how German film discourse has been conceptualizing political filmmaking, which is almost inevitably seen as synonymous with leftist filmmaking ever since. As a hypothesis, I would submit that the experience of this tattooing moment as a violation of its dogma has significantly limited the left's ability to respond to the emerging larger sociocultural, political, and economic changes in the midst of which it found itself, but the nature of which it might have misrecognized. And conversely, I would speculatively hold that this tattooing moment's joyfulness might have marked or rendered sensible the very potential that could have redirected the left from primarily fighting what Byung-Chul Han recently theorized as the violence of negativity to attending to what he calls the violence of positivity, terms I'll return to in a little while. For the moment, I simply want to propose that it is this shift in violence affective vector that can productively be used to frame the moment of 68, that point in recent history in West Germany and the larger capitalist West that, at least with the benefit of hindsight, can be said to have coincided with the emergence of what we now varyingly call neoliberalism, the age of control, or the regime of biopolitics. The story of Schaaf's film is quickly summarized. And I'll show you some clips as I will sort of keep reading over it. There won't be any sound, but you get some impressions of what I'm talking about. Benno, a teenager on the cusp of adulthood, is adopted by the Lohmans, a bourgeois, childless husband and wife who own a mosaic stone manufactory which is located close to the Berlin Wall. The couple has also adopted the wife's niece, Gabi. They seek to re-socialize Benno, who used to live in a Jugendhof, a home for troubled youth. But notwithstanding, or better, because of all the seemingly liberal tolerance with which they respond to Benno's less than proper behavior, they ultimately fail to get him to play their game. Differently put, the more the ostensibly liberal representatives of West Germany's post-war economic miracle seek to normalize Benno's aberrant behavior by casually excusing each and every one of his intentionally or not rebellious actions, the more they transform his newfound liberty into a prison that is more all-encompassing than the reformatory from which he was rescued ever was. That is, the more the parents try to fold Benno into their lifestyle, the less freedom he experiences. Instead of pulling him closer into society's bosom of liberal conformity, their love, which is always really self-love, pushes him ever further away. Ultimately, Benno refuses to give in to the violence of positivity with which they seek to embrace him, and instead has one last recourse to an act of violence whose vector is negative. And maybe I should say spoiler alert, but you will see the ending, so sorry about that. Leaving aside Schaaf's own political allegiances, I think that Benno's ultimate refusal, the reason for which is never explained, renders affectively sensible for the viewer precisely that moment of transformation that the aesthetic left began to sense intellectually, and to which it tried to respond by pleading for a different mode of critical practice and at least implicitly political filmmaking. To wit, a moment when we can witness the vectorial reversal from disciplinarity to control, from Fordism to post-Fordism, from a regime of power still operating with recourse to the violence of negativity to one whose engine is the violence of positivity. Crucially, what the violence of positivity manages to do, so Tattoo suggests, is control the affectively uncontainable, because unpredictable, political force of violence by ever more intensifying a cultural experience of joy. We might say that neoliberal capitalism's promulgation of joy, which, according to Han's analysis, has assumed near totalizing hold of contemporary society, constitutes a new form of violence, the violence of joy. In this violence, the relentless incitement of us to enjoy ourselves works as a crucial managing tool to control the joy of violence. Let me try to map this out via recourse to a few moments in Schaaf's film. Around 25 minutes into it, Benno and a group of motorcyclists have gathered at a mechanic shop run by semi-criminal Ziggy. One of the guys is throwing darts at a poster of a naked pinup girl hanging on the wall when Ziggy takes a dart from him and instantly hits Bull's eye, her navel, which prompts him to declare, you gotta have it here, as he's pointing to his head. In reply, the guy remarks, with a real girl you gotta have it somewhere else altogether, causing his buddies to jeer. Embarrassed, Ziggy throws the gang out of his shop, agitatively talks at Benno, and eventually throws in quick succession a handful of darts at the poster, hitting the woman's nipples and her navel, a feat that prompts him to declare with satisfaction, "There you go." Having witnessed Ziggy's outburst at the joy he took in hitting the pinup's prime targets, Benno tells Ziggy about a cat that was run over by a waste removal truck. Ziggy, however, is not interested, prompting Benno to pull a dart from the pinup poster's girl's genital area and to carefully aim at her. Just at the moment when he throws the dart, the film cuts to a perfectly framed close-up of Mr. Lohman, looking somewhat drunk, holding a cigarette and humming along to a soft dance tune. As this new scene continues, we see how Lohman's wife is dancing with their family friend, and subsequently how Lohman jovially takes over the dancing duties with a formal gesture typical for a self-satisfied patriarchal bourgeoisie in which men pass women on among each other as their prized possessions. Much could be said about this scene, starting with the obvious misogyny exhibited by the young man and Ziggy, who, like Lohman, treats Benno more as a screen onto which he can project his own idealized self-image than as a subject who is trying to leave his own mark on the world. Yet I'm most interested here in the associative cut that violently links the two scenes, for I think it marks something in the film as well as about the point in time to which it belongs that has gone unnoticed. For this cut not only marks Benno's desire not to become part of Lohman's seemingly warm and well-meaning embrace, a desire that will intensify and eventually culminate in a seemingly unmotivated shooting of his adoptive father, it also renders sensible the crucial reversal that the relationship joy has to violence undergoes, not just in this film, but also in the world that, according to some, Tattoo depicts with a great degree of contemporary realism and of which it is said to be a precise witness. For what this cut links and in linking separates is precisely the joy of violence experienced and affirmed by Benno as well as Ziggy during the dart throwing scene and the violence of joy that permeates Lohman's world. Indeed, this curious reversal is introduced already in the film's opening scene. For a little over and imagine there's sort of like a loud jazzy soundtrack going on. For a little over 4 minutes, we see a horde of male teenagers chasing a young man, Benno. Only towards the scene's end do we learn of the reason for the chase. Benno has apparently hidden a gun that he stole from someone else. Initially, however, all we can discern is the apparent joy the film takes in staging the chase's kinetic force. Starting in medias res, Tattoo shows us everyone running until Benno finds himself suddenly caught, seemingly unable to escape. We momentarily expect for the group to harm him, an impression we sense Benno shares given his nervous gaze. But then his apparent nervousness gives rise to a sheepish, perhaps even idiotic grin, at which moment he breaks through the crowd and escapes. The scene repeats this chase, capture, escape pattern 3 more times. Each time, the moment of capture would have to be deemed utterly superfluous if we were to consider it through the lens of realism. Realistically speaking, for example, the young men surely would have waited till the authority figures, whose appearance prompted them to momentarily stop their chase, would have been well out of sight and earshot before recommencing their activities. Yet they do not wait. And they don't, I think, because the film is at this moment less interested in realism than in affecting the viewer with the very joy these young men take in the chase itself, the intention of which we still cannot determine with certainty. Is it merely a game or something more serious? Importantly, however, it is not just they who take joy in doing so, in their threats of violence. The film itself affirms this joy as well, precisely by prolonging this dynamic over the course of almost 4 minutes, during which any pretense to realism is abandoned. Quite clearly, as viewers, we are not asked to look at this scene as primarily something that depicts the real world of teenagers in a disciplinary environment, but rather as a stylized rendering of the affective quality inherent to this scene of joyous violence as it is experienced by both the chasers and the chased, and thus also by us. Finally, however, the group has Benno pinned down on his back and threatens to harm him with a drill. Just when the group's leader starts drilling into Benno's chest in an effort to make him reveal the gun's location, the perpetrators are forced to abandon their violent action because yet another authority figure has entered the premises, causing everyone to leave but Benno, who lingers for a while, pressing a napkin against a slightly bleeding wound, his tattoo. This image concludes a scene that can be said to expose us to a moment of autonomy enjoyed by the protagonists who live in a paradigmatic space of what Michel Foucault famously called disciplinary power. The Jugendhof is a strictly regulated environment of confinement that subjects its inhabitants to an operation of power that is less interested in exerting direct violence on their bodies than in regulating the very space surrounding their potential for action. Disciplinary power, in other words, does not directly work on the body as such, but rather on its potential or capacity, on what it can do. In Tattoo, we see this precisely at the moment when the teenagers pause their chase. It is not necessary for an authority figure to tell them to stop or even to make an effort to notice them, for they have internalized the spatial forces regulating their confined environment enough so that they self-regulate. Yet, their self-regulation is not complete. In this disciplinary space defined by a violence of negativity, cracks, interstices for the experience of the joy of violence still exist. And Schaaf goes out of his way to render this joy sensible, rather than merely representing it in realistic fashion, a violent conflict among teenagers. It is precisely in these cracks, during the moments when they can chase with abandon, where the teenagers experience their greatest degree of joy, of autonomy, notwithstanding the violence inscribed in this action. We might say it is because of the potential for violence that permeates the experience of the chase that they are subject to an affect of joy, indeed that they are joyful. They are subject to the joys violence can provide, even though the actual moment of violence, the tattooing of Benno's chest, is as such not rendered as joyful, neither for the teenagers, nor for Benno, nor for us. The point, though, is that this moment is not the scene's realistic telos or goal, or else Schaaf would have simply cut to the chase, as it were, and shown the group beating Benno up. Thus, notwithstanding the final occurrence of violence, the damaging of Benno's chest, the film is less interested in the depiction of this violence than in rendering sensible the joy of violence, a joy that results from the decidedly unrealistically staged deferral of the final and perhaps inevitable moment of pain. The film begins thus in a space of confinement where its subjects experience autonomy precisely through the joy of violence. This disciplinary space and its affect of joy are what frame the rest of the film, whose plot properly begins with the next scene, of which you saw like the beginning, in which we are introduced to Mr. Lohman, who, sitting in the backseat of a car next to Benno, tells him that he bought a moped for him as a gift, before informing him that Benno will have to pay it off over time so that he learns the meaning of, you guessed it, property. Throughout the scene, Lohman is exceedingly affable, reasonable, and well-meaning. Yet he is a representative of the generation that was perceived as mendacious by the very protagonists of the revolts constituting what scholars today call the Long 68. That famous event, the violence of which Tattoo presciently, if not prophetically, anticipated in a moment of historical coincidence. Its release date preceded the student protest against the visit of the Shah of Persia to West Berlin by only a few weeks. At this event, student Benno Ohnesorg was murdered by a policeman, an act that triggered the radicalization of the left-wing student movement, some of whom, not least the Red Army faction or RAF, eventually went underground and started fighting the state's violence with violence. While the prophetic aspect of Tattoo is surely intriguing, I'm more interested in arguing that Schaaf's film in fact tuned into a social dynamic that was only in the process of emerging and remained largely unnoticed. Unnoticed, I think, not least because of the violent developments of what are known as the leaden years. In other words, whereas soon West Germany would increasingly be traumatized by bullets flying between police and the RAF, Tattoo gives us a sense of an altogether different enemy, one that would prove to be considerably more insidious and formidable than the one the student radicals of '68 imagined themselves to be facing. Byung-Chul Han systematically theorizes the moment Tattoo tapped into by distinguishing between the violence of negativity and the violence of positivity and framing it in the context of neoliberalism. the very regime of power that emerged around 68. And I know that's not necessarily agreed upon, but another thinker in the background is Foucault, and Foucault explicitly argues in his biopolitical lectures about West Germany, that West Germany was founded as a neoliberal state in 1949, and then traces this out forward. So this quote here, neoliberal psychopolitics from Han is dominated by positivity. Instead of administering bitter medicine, it enlists liking. It flatters the psyche instead of shaking it and paralyzing it with shocks. Neoliberal psychopolitics seduces the soul. It preempts it in lieu of opposing it. It carefully protocols desires, needs, and wishes instead of depattering them. By means of calculated prognoses, it anticipates actions and acts ahead of them instead of calling them out. Neoliberal psychopolitics is smart politics. It seeks to please and fulfill, not to repress. This violence of positivity is the essence of what Han calls the achievement society. This contemporary violence is based, he argues, more on the conformity of consensus than on the antagonism of dissent. I find this distinction illuminating and indeed crucial because Han maps this distinction between neoliberalism and its predecessor onto a shift in the deployment and ultimately the affective register of violence itself. Tattoo can be seen as symptomatically dramatizing this vectorial shift in the function of violence from that of negativity to that of positivity. In a way, the film plays out the conflict between these two kinds of violence and perhaps unwittingly ended up being among the first to hint at, if not actually show, how the neoliberal psychopolitical violence of positivity is just as destructive, if not more, as the disciplinary violence of negativity. What Shah's film tapped into, then, is less the zeitgeist of violent revolt that culminated in the RAF's actions, though it did this too, than the appearance of the violence of positivity that would become characteristic of the neoliberal achievement society. Moreover, Tattoo shows that the latter's violence is a violence of joy whose operative force is directed at controlling the very joy of violence that still disturbed the disciplinary regime of power that had recourse to a violence of negativity. One of the most important functions of the violence of positivity is to take away any firm ground from which one can launch one's resistance. This in any case is what Tattoo compellingly demonstrates. More than anything, Benno cannot get used to the seemingly boundless patience and tolerance with which Lohman and his wife respond to him, as representatives of the newly established agents of a fundamentally conservative West German bourgeoisie, which at its cutting edge is sensing at the time that this basis for its economic prowess and thus social power is gradually undergoing a transformation. The couple exposes Benno to a new figure of authority, or rather, a new operation of power that manages to absorb any resistance directed at it by folding it into its own operational system of positivity. The cut that links the poster of the pinup girl and Lohman's face perfectly dramatizes this dynamic. Whereas the poster offers a stable target and thus one available for an act of however imaginary resistance, of violence, and indeed of joy, Lohman's drunkenly grinning face seems an unreachable target for Benno's dart throw. If the poster still decidedly belongs to the space of the Fordist system of capitalism, Lohman's face, notwithstanding his ownership of a mosaic manufactory, belongs at a minimum to someone who is already on the cusp of a post-Fordist communicative and service capitalist space in which immaterial affective relations increasingly become the target for valorization processes. Lohman's joyful grin is expressive of an achievement society that instead of working with negative threats, works with positive stimuli. Of course, in 1967, all of this was still in its infancy. Knowingly or not, Tattoo seismographically senses this shift from disciplinarity to control, thereby giving, intentionally or not, evidence to Shah's claim that, quote, politically correctly intended films often miss reality, while films whose primary intentions are not primarily political can aesthetically get at or render reality in ways, I would add, that a widespread obsession with a film's content and the justness of its representation thereof is almost inevitably bound to ignore. Time and again, Shah shows us how Benno tries to return to the disciplinary regime in which we saw him experience his greatest joy. A joy he experienced not in spite of its violence, but because or as a result of it. A joy that we could justly call the joy of violence. Yet no matter what Benno does, quitting his job, madly acting out in public, stealing, or having sex with his adopted sister under the Lohrmann's roof, he cannot do any wrong. Nothing that Benno does can unnerve Lohrmann enough for him to have recourse to more traditional methods of disciplining, that is, the violence of negativity. Yet this violence of negativity can still be resisted, as we saw in the opening scene and in the dart-throwing scene, where resistance is at least still imagined, as it were, by Benno's mind's eye and certainly by the film itself in form of its violent cut. For it is here, echoing the cut linking the film's first two scenes, that is, linking the regime of disciplinarity with its attendant joy of violence on the one hand, and in sharp contrast the regime of soft control with its attendant violence of joy, that we again sense the joy of violence, which Benno directs at the absent Lohrmann, who is nevertheless imagined as the real target of his well-aimed, vigorous dart throw at the pin-up girl. This joy of violence is also rendered visible when Benno is at a drive-in cinema together with Sigi and two young women with whom he hopes to have a foursome of sorts. Benno, however, shows no sexual interest and instead becomes fascinated by the Italo-Western on the big screen. The Western genre is, of course, very much an expression of the violence of negativity, where the enemy can still be known and thus resisted using his own tools. It is this capacity to resist, to turn the tools of the enemy against him, that Lohrmann and the emerging regime of power he embodies is taken away from Benno. It is this inability to resist, indeed the very sense that resistance is no longer possible, that Benno gradually finds affectively intolerable. Importantly, however, the film does not try to teach us, let alone in moralizing fashion, that such resistance is futile. Nor, however, does it justify Benno's final act of real violence. Rather, by rendering sensible both the violence of negativity and the violence of positivity, the former through the affect of joy, the latter through that of despair, Tattoo leaves us with a feeling, a sense that something is terribly amiss, even if the film does not show us of what this something consists. In this regard, the film's closing moments are telling. As the four are strolling in pastoral scenery, Benno and Gabi momentarily escape the Lohrmann's gaze. When they encounter a young man with a car, incidentally played by New Munich Group filmmaker Roger Fritz, Gabi seizes the opportunity to get a ride to the city, leaving Benno behind. At just this moment, the Lohrmanns reappear, cheerily waving at him from some distance, only to be stunned by the 4 gunshots Benno fires at them. As it gradually dawns on Mrs. Lohrmann that her husband has been shot, the camera captures Benno running away, clearly elated. After a quick shot of a hot air balloon rising over Berlin, the film cuts to its final location, a swimming pool. Benno, who is momentarily alone, jumps nakedly into the pool, and across a series of wide cuts, he frantically splashes about, not even minding the 2 policemen who soon appear to arrest him. As the soundtrack's volume, and again this is this jazzy soundtrack, increases and thereby further stylizes the scene, he joyfully swims to and fro, spasmodically dives and re-emerges as if he finally were in his true element. A fish not out of water, but decidedly back in it. More than one recent commentator, looking back at the film upon its DVD release in 2015, reads Benno's murder of Lohrmann as an act of liberation, even if they acknowledge that it does not necessarily seem plausible. Conversely, perhaps the most astute reading of the film's ending was provided by Werner Klies in his review of the film upon its original release in 1967, in which he argued that Benno liberates himself from freedom by committing murder. It strikes me that both assertions are correct, but only if they are simultaneously affirmed. Benno indeed frees himself, but that act of liberation, in the form of a joyful affirmation of violence, of the violence of negativity, is in itself less a way out than a way back into the disciplinary regime of power that he clearly seems to prefer to the newly emerging society of neoliberal control, notwithstanding the fact that the peers he had left behind at the Jugendhof no longer seemed to be interested in him, not even as someone to whom they could do harm, as we see in an earlier scene when he tries to join them for a match of soccer. They just ignore him. With this final moment then, the film returns to its opening, but with a difference. Just as the first scene is not a realistic representation of a conflict, so the final scene does not offer a realistic representation of Benno's final moment in freedom. The film quite explicitly frames its main storyline with the help of heavily aestheticized images of pure movement. The teenager's frantic running and Benno's uninhibited, very much childlike moving about in water. Yet while the film uses its opening to set up its investigation into whether Benno would actually be freer outside the disciplinary confinement of the Jugendhof, with its closing moment, it does not answer this question in the negative, for it is clear that Benno will not be free in confinement, whatever form of discipline he will be subjected to as a result of his murder. But Benno was also not free as a temporary member of an allegedly liberal bourgeois society that smugly takes pride in its accomplishments, including its new post-fascistic morality and attitudes. That is, the film does not nostalgically suggest that the disciplinary regime of power would be preferable to what was then a still emerging new mode of power of which the film caught a glimpse, even though it depicts how Benno cannot survive in freedom. Rather, what Tattoo hints at, I think, is that the dialectic of freedom and confinement, characteristic of the violence of negativity in the disciplinary mode of power, is undergoing a transformation, with the result that in the new regime of neoliberal control, it is freedom itself that incarcerates us. Or as Han puts it, quote, "We are living in a particular phase of history. Freedom itself is bringing forth compulsion and constraint. The freedom of can generates even more coercion than the disciplinarian should." Thus, Tattoo is not a topically driven film about anything in particular, neither about youth criminality in foster homes, nor about the sensibilities of youth in the divided Berlin on the eve of the student movement, though both topics are present in the film. Tattoo instead instills in viewers a sense of something that is not representable as such, namely the undoing of freedom by freedom itself, as a process that cannot be seen, only sensed. In this regard, then, we might hold that Tattoo certainly sensed that something was in the air. It not just depicted, but criticized its time, seeing with remarkable clarity a society in the process of changing at the very moment when it narcissistically celebrated its stability as its greatest post-war accomplishments. Eerily prescient, the film witnessed a violence to come that would shatter the West German consensus and its ultimately conservative liberalism that, so Tattoo subversively suggests, generously tolerated everything so that nothing would have to change with regard to its power relations. Yet Tattoo intuits something else as well, namely that this violence to come would not be a viable political solution, precisely because the very disciplinary regime of power, with its violence of negativity, was in the process of becoming a residual mode of power rather than being the dominant mode of power it used to be. The emerging regime of control is predicated, as I have argued, on the violence of positivity, and thus the violence of joy, that controls the system-threatening affect that is expressed by the joy of violence. In this regard, the film provided in 1967 a political diagnosis that was untimely, which is to say, it was not heeded at the time, not least by the political left, which increasingly would perceive the repressive, what they would call fascistic state, as its main enemy. Of course, the state still relied on, and whenever pushed was quite willing to have recourse to the violence of negativity that was the dominant operative engine of the disciplinary regime of power. Yet, the political left might have ignored, or at least not taken seriously enough, the fact that the state itself was at that very moment already in the process of being overcoded by a different logic, an emerging, if not yet dominant logic of violence, the violence of positivity. Allow me to offer a speculative conclusion. I do wonder whether in the West German film context at least, it was not the aesthetic left that understood this better than the political left. In other words, ironically, it might have been the aesthetic left, which was often accused of being apolitical and is seen as such to this day, that possibly pointed the way to a more astute political analysis of the very moment when the shift towards a neoliberal controlled society occurred in West Germany than the more traditionally engaged political left. And it did so perhaps because it was more in tune with the different affective registers of violence permeating the two regimes of power. For in aesthetic terms, the violence of negativity is, for lack of a better phrase, a traditional form of violence, one that can be represented and thus fought. The violence of positivity, in contrast, is one permeated or constituted by asignifying affects that cannot be represented, and in which the tools and strategies of traditional political left, including its filmmaking wing, no longer have any purchase. The consequences of this misdiagnosis, if it is one, were grave, and they linger on to this day. Does this then mean all is lost? Perhaps. I don't think in any case that tattoo offers an easy solution, and I certainly don't have any. If anything, it's not the act of shooting that the film affirms, as if it were nostalgic for the disciplinary regime, but rather the very refusal to play the achievement society's game, to allow oneself to be folded into its violence of positivity. This absolute refusal, intriguingly, is enacted by someone whom we might fruitfully characterize through the lens of idiotism that concludes Han's analysis of neoliberalism in his book Psychopolitics. Taking his cue from Deleuze's argument that, quote, playing the fool has always been one of the functions of philosophy, end quote, Han writes that idiotism stands opposed to the neoliberal power of domination, total communication and total surveillance, for the idiot does not communicate, or rather communicates with the incommunicable, and as such veils himself in silence. Benno seems to exhibit traits of such idiotism. He barely speaks, and when he does, he rarely seems to succeed in his attempt to communicate, to be understood, pace Lohmann's repeated declaration to the contrary. He is visibly put off by the endless, friendly palaver to which Lohmann subjects him, and more than once it appears as if he is playing the fool. In this, the young Christoph Wackernagel's nearly blank face, with features more evocative of a child than a young man and marked by a smile that borders on an idiotic grin, felicitously enhances the character he plays. But regardless of how viewers respond to his acting and his face, the film's final moment seems to suggest that an affect of joyfulness is embodied in and enacted by his idiotically splashing body in the pool as he refuses either to heed the police's communicative actions directed at him, they say come out of the water, or to communicate anything whatsoever, not just to the cops, but also to us as viewers. For what would his message possibly be? Han argues that in light of compulsive and coercive communication and conformism, which the violence of positivity of the society of control effects in its subjects, idiotism represents a practice of freedom. By nature, writes Han, the idiot is unallied, unnetworked, and uninformed. The idiot inhabits an immemorial outside which escapes communication and networking altogether. Benno can certainly not be reached by the excessively communicative, always pedagogically inclined Lohmann. In his radical affirmation of the experience of the joy of violence, then, Benno can perhaps be considered a heretical figure, a figure who, Han argues, commands free choice, the courage to deviate from orthodoxy. As a heretic, Han continues, the idiot represents a figure of resistance, opposing the violence of consensus, that is, the violence of positivity. But maybe it is not even that the idiot represents anything, least of all a figure of resistance. The idiot, in his childlike way of relating to the world, simply refuses. He embodies or enacts a sense of absolute refusal, a Bartleby-ian, if you will, I would prefer not to, without ever declaring what exactly he would prefer not to do or be. The concept of resistance, it seems to me, still very much belongs to the violence of negativity, to the regime of disciplinarity. But if Han is right, that this regime has passed, then I'm not so sure resistance is the right mode of responding to the society of control. Absolute refusal, on the other hand, as Bartleby's story indicates in untimely visionary fashion, but that perhaps is also expressed by Benno's story, might be less easy for the neoliberal regime of power to handle, insofar as such absolute refusal operates precisely in reverse fashion from the society of control that swallows every resistance up as if it were a gigantic black hole. Absolute refusal, we might say, constitutes a different style of response, one that Deleuze expresses with reference to the singularity of children. Very small children, he writes, all resemble one another and have hardly any individuality or subjective qualities, but they do have singularities. A smile, a gesture, a funny face. The idiot qua child, or the child qua idiot, which seems to me what Benno was at the beginning and a state to which he reverts back at the end of Tattoo, is thoroughly desubjectified and de-psychologized. As such, he simultaneously is utterly other too and effects an eruption within the very system of control that, through its relentless violence of positivity, through its endless exhortation of us to be positive and communicative, subjectivizes and thus subjects us. Such singularity is precisely a matter of style and thus of aesthetics, not content. But this style is not that of realism. Indeed, to argue that such a childlike or idiotic absolute refusal is simply not realistic is both to miss the aesthetic register of such refusal and to ventriloquize the crucial ideological gesture tirelessly performed by what Mark Fisher astutely diagnosed as capitalist realism, to wit, to dismiss as unrealistic everything that does not ultimately support the operations of the contemporary regime of power. Perhaps it is this fundamentally anti-utopian development that the aesthetic left was able to sense more so than the political left during the heated debate in the mid to late 60s. For the violence of positivity is sensible more on an aesthetic register than on that of content, more on the level of asignifying presubjective affect than on that of representational cognition, and more by an idiot in a Deleuzian sense than by an ideologue. Whether or not one can actually ever create a promising politics of idiocy is a question that decidedly remains unanswered by the film, and that is perhaps unanswerable. In any case, that it might be possible to build a political program, and thus a resistance movement around this figure is something the political left always doubted and thus rejected. But maybe it's nevertheless worth rethinking, by taking the aesthetic left's impetus finally seriously, how best to negotiate rather than negate the violence of positivity that has enveloped us all. And doing so might require the genealogical tracing of an other politics, a politics of the aesthetic left rather than, though definitely not in opposition to, a politics of the political left. My overall hypothesis then is that precisely because of the transformations that occurred in West Germany and elsewhere in the late 1960s, any discussion today of the cinema's political potential from a left point of view must reassess the very assumptions underlying claims about what counts as political cinema. Assumptions, as I've tried to suggest, that might have been grounded in a misrecognition of who the real enemy was at the very moment when a notion of political cinema solidified itself in West Germany. Admittedly, it remains to be seen whether closer analysis of a number of films themselves bear out my hypothesis. Films by a rather heterodox group of filmmakers spanning half a century, including the New Munich group, directors such as Roland Klick and Dominik Graf, the Berlin School, and the so-called Kölner Gruppe, to name just a few, and these are just people that I'm interested in. In any case, the fact that the aesthetic left was received with considerable irritation marks something. And perhaps this something, in all its complex forms of articulation, was the desire of those who had, to use Ranciere's famous formulation, a part in the count to prevent those who had no part in the existing distribution of the sensible from issuing their disagreement. And they, those who had a part in the count, did this precisely by linking the latter's aesthetics as the antithesis to left politics to the realm of the ideological enemy, the United States, i.e. capitalism, and Hollywood, i.e. escapism. It may then not have been coincidental that the young filmmakers of the New Munich group were attacked as right-wing for the simple reason that they, like the young Turks of the Nouvelle Vague, such as Godard and Truffaut, loved filmmakers such as Howard Hawks and John Ford. But perhaps the films of the aesthetic left constitute a subterranean tradition of an other politics, and the rendering sensible of which might require a genealogical tracing in Foucault's sense. As you recall, the aim of genealogy is twofold. First, to grasp the present, i.e. to understand or produce some sort of knowledge about the character of contemporary reality. And second, to transform that reality by opening up new possibilities for thought and action. These two aims must be understood together. As Foucault puts it, genealogical inquiry aims to transform the present by grasping more fully what it is. And to do this, one has to ask, what place is occupied by whatever is singular, contingent, and the product of arbitrary constraints in what is given to us as universal, necessary, obligatory? That is, what artifacts of the present, which appear as necessities, are in fact merely contingent limitations on what we can do or think. I wonder if such a genealogical tracing might be able to produce, as it were, a politics of the left against the left, or with a nod to Jacques Derrida's claim that Walter Benjamin's thought was messianic without messianism, of a left politics without leftism. Thank you. All right, we have time for complaints and comments and questions and disagreements.
Thank you, Marco. That was very interesting. I'd never seen the film either, and your presentation of it made me wonder if it was, I mean, quite honestly, some kind of weird German The Graduate, but preceding The Graduate by some years. But then I got to thinking about another form, and I don't know if it was Wozzeck or Strozeck, but the idea of a kind of the human being is raised or raises himself out in nature and returns to civilization. I mean, you probably have a word for this, but to what degree can you see this film as that this is kind of a human being who's not really in control of this very strange environment, that just kind of things happen to him, and both on one side the violence of the young boys and the what you call the violence of neoliberalism. I mean, is this consistent with your thinking?
So what I think is going on in Tätowierung, in tattoo, is that that there is no transcendence, so to speak, right? Like there's sort of no sort of like, I think I stand corrected, Chris Wahl is a Herzog expert, I'm not, but I think there is a way of looking at Herzog where there is sort of like a desire for a certain kind of transcendence. Whereas this film, what intrigues me about the film is that it doesn't do that. It treats, so to speak, the two options that it diagnoses, right? Like, which is already, like in my argument, something that was quite new and unusual for the time. Precisely because something like neoliberalism no one talked about neoliberalism at the time, right? It wasn't a concept at the time for people outside of some scholars, right? Like, but this was not something we would read about, generally speaking. That it nevertheless sort of takes them at face value on the same plane and maps out that whatever the sort of like trying to become human again, so to speak, that's, like where you sort of like you find yourself over here suddenly and you're not being heard, right? Like Benno is not being heard. Even though his father constantly insists that he's hearing them, right? Like this sort of well-meaning embrace, but that he wants to get back to this other sphere where he was heard. But the film steps back and says like, yes, you were heard there, but this is hardly something that is worthwhile getting back to either, right? So like the film is sort of saying, well, the present is pretty bad as it understands this, but you can't go back because that thing is not any better. It's different, and it operates differently, right? But the solution, as I said, I don't think that tattoo has any solution. It's, if anything, it offers us an interesting diagnosis of saying we need to pay attention to the forces that are at that moment in the process of emerging and to sort of solidify themselves as increasingly govern of how we live. And that if we hold on to that older model and think that getting back there will be somewhat better, we are mistaken as well, right? But there is no outside in that regard this is my reading of the film in any case. Again, it could be obviously, can be debated, but I don't think the film posits an outside, which is why I don't think that when the critics read the ending, right, like as an aside, the actor, Christoph Wackernagel, ultimately became a member of the RAF 10 years down the road and was in prison for over 10 years. And he was at the film festival 2 years ago. He's an actor again, and he ran like a German bread store somewhere in Asia and all that kind of stuff. But he was there. It was quite interesting, So, but of course, there's no connection to the film in that regard, right? There's 10 years. That would be silly, I think, to suggest like a cause and effect there of his actual real life actions. But the film often, I think, gets read sometimes or frequently that the ending is some sort of, this is the solution, right? Like, even if we may not always agree with murder, but like this is the way that sort of lifts him out of his problem. But that seems patently false to me. It doesn't. Like, the film shows that it doesn't, right? And I think we also in the real world know that it doesn't. You know? So I think, I mean, like, your connections to, like, I haven't thought about the connection to something like The Graduate or like these Herzog films. Like, I might have to think about them more. I should say that the motivation for my project has also something to do with the fact that the more famous part of German film history, West German film history, from the late 60s to, you know, like sort of into the early 80s, is New German cinema, of which Herzog, of course, is an important figure. And I want to sort of like I'm interested in some people that are not part of that fairly well-known story by now, right? Like the Fassbenders, the Herzogs, the Wenders, the von Trotters, the Volker Schlöndorff, one of the trustees here, and so on. Not because I don't like their films. There are plenty of those films that I like. Not because I think they are not interesting responses to their own time. But I am interested in a recovery project, right? Like to sort of bring some other people back into German film history, but not for history's sake alone, but also because I think they can perhaps, in an imaginative way, get us to think about certain things in a slightly different way, right? Like, and I don't know what the outcome of that, I mean, I would have written the book by now if I knew what the outcome of this would be. And so it's entirely possible that this will be a failure. I mean this seriously. Like, I don't know where I ultimately will arrive, right? Like, it's a little bit of an experiment. There are some things that are hunches, or some things that I believe are right in terms of what I'm saying, and I'm happy to defend my reading of this film, you know. But I'm not, like, some of the things that I'm putting together, and Schaaf is not a member of the New Munich group or of the aesthetic left, right? Like, sort of like he's, like, I think he can't be located this way, but they all exist at the same time, and you know, like I think it's worthwhile from a film historical perspective to take a look at this again. Tatjana, and then maybe Ilka after.
Thank you for this really compelling talk. I wondered, sort of both locally in terms of your reading of the film and the bigger picture of the project, if you could talk a little bit or think through play and the relationship between play and violence. I was kind of surprised that this wasn't a word that sort of popped up as you were speaking, because of course the darts, that's play, it's sort of pre-violence, and the running too is play, right, before it becomes violent and kind of unpleasant to us. Right. And then at the end, I thought, well, okay, so this might be a contrast with sort of the real violence that this character produces toward the end. But that, too, is so stylized that it looks like play. And then in terms of the larger picture of the project, this idea, which I like very much, of absolute resistance and non-transcendence. And, of course, play can and has been historically a way of resisting without transcendence. So I wondered if this is something that's operative in the project, or if where it fits into the picture.
So thank you for the question. It's a question that I have not thought about yet, but I can say a few things about this. So one, the notion of play, I am actually quite attracted to some of those films because they are playful. And certainly in the film historical context at the time, that's to some degree where the debate came in between the sort of the so-called aesthetic left and the political left. And this is still something, I mean, at least the filmmaker tell me that for years and years and to this day, the people who are sort of associated with the aesthetic left often had to hear, are you children? Right, like, so that the political left filmmakers, like who are so, like, they were the parents, and they were treating the aesthetic left, who are playful, precisely as children. Which, when I heard this, I thought this was quite interesting, you know, like, and I have not yet gotten to fully developing the thought, but I think there is something there. Then, secondly, the question of violence that you sort of allude to is, you know, I mentioned my first book. In that book, I'm sort of putting out a thesis that's probably also, I don't know if it's tenable, but I'm saying there's no outside to violence. There is nothing other than violence, actually. It's just a sliding scale. But what I'm doing right now is also violence. But that's not to then downplay certain kinds of violence, but actually I want to insist that by suggesting in a moralizing fashion there's violence and then there's this non-violence, it costs us the whole thing. right? And that's basically the thesis of the first book. So something like, that's why I'm saying it's like the real violence that we're seeing. I mean, of course, this is a film, and we have to sort of remember this too, right? Like that sometimes, this is where I tend to get irritated sometimes when you sort of see in a certain critical tradition or critical practice, you know, like people sort of start forgetting that they're dealing with an art form here also that's you know, is designed to do certain things. We can obviously debate of, like, you know, the gratuity of violence and all that kind of stuff, right? The familiar debates, but play for me is also in that sense like it's a form, it's a certain form of violence, whether the play itself is traditional violence or not. However, what I want to argue is less that play has something to do with aesthetic resistance than with refusal, and I'm distinguishing between those two categories. To me, resistance is a dialectical operation, and refusal is not. And this comes out of a philosophical tradition for sure that I happen to be invested in, and that I happen to sort of have, you know, I accept that as more interesting than the Hegelian tradition. And so to me, like, resistance is in the end always dialectical negation. We can talk more about this undoubtedly, whereas the refusal notion is immanence, and it has to be absolute refusal. But as, you know, to what extent, this is why I'm acknowledging this also in this talk, you can build, and we have political scientists here and journalists and who are very much interested in real world problems right now, right? This must probably sound ludicrous, right? And that might very well be what it is. It's not, I'm not, you know, sort of saying that this film gives us the solution to solve the immigration crisis or whatever, right? Like, but it is, and I think this is the strength of art, of whatever its form is. It's a form of it's an imaginative way of reasoning. It is getting at something that sort of the more positivistic kind of way of how we tend to think about things is not giving us access to. And so I think that precisely filmmakers and writers and visual artists and so on, they can prompt us, provoke us into questioning some of the basic concepts that we seem to take for granted. So hence the Foucault point there also, like that we're sort of like, apparently we all know what politics is, but I'm not so sure that we do. That doesn't mean I know what politics is, but I'm not sure that we can just accept what usually goes through as left politics, right? Like, and so I think again for people who, if they were here, if Volker Schlindorf were here, I think he would probably strongly disagree with what I'm arguing, because I think that they would look at some of those aesthetic left, and again, they were not, the filmmakers were not necessarily known as aesthetic left filmmakers, but the critics who identified themselves to some degree as aesthetic left, they wrote favorably about those filmmakers. And so I'm sort of inferring that perhaps we can conceptualize them along those lines. But, you know, the Alexander Kluges of the world would probably strongly disagree with looking at them as leftist filmmakers. But that's why I'm saying, you know, like left politics without leftism, because I want to sort of slightly rethink perhaps that relationship. Yeah. Ilka had the next question, sorry.
Thank you. Also, thank you very much for your talk. I think I can follow your argument very well, and I have one question about the end. This shooting is the very cinematic idea of acting, and but at the same time, it is not a conventional filmic acting. It is not the Benno is not coming. He would not succeed with his problems by acting. And at the same time, left theory, there's acting also an important thing. So I think it's maybe in the same direction, thinking in your direction. I don't know.
Yeah. So just to make sure that I understand everything. So what you're saying, as I heard it, is that Benno would not succeed with his actions, right? Like so, and the film is, I think. To me, the film is clear about this, even though the film doesn't show him being incarcerated, right? But it's very clear he's got nowhere to go. Like he will be, you know, handcuffed, etc. So he's not. So there is a certain kind of, in my argument, that's why I'm arguing that the film is not affirming that action in and of itself. And in left theory, there is of course a long-standing debate about the relationship between acting and theory, for instance, also. And certainly at the time, if you think, those of you who are sort of immersed or familiar with those discourses, I mean, the figure like Adorno is, very much under attack at that moment from his own students, because they accused Adorno of being just a theorist and not supporting their actions, right? And Adorno, of course, sort of shot back, figuratively speaking, at the students and accused him of pseudo actions, right? He's saying like you are acting in, and this was something where the debate between Marcuse and Adorno comes in, right? But he was saying it's like, you guys you think you are acting, but this is actually pseudo action because it's not properly reflected upon, right? Like that was sort of where that debate comes in. If you wonder where I'm coming out, I'm on Adorno's side with this regard, without question. And this gets perhaps also in a weird way back to the question of play. One of the things that I found while I was working on this project, sort of before I switched more to the New Munich project, is in the archive I found an essay by Wolfgang Schütte, who was a prominent leftist Adornian critic in the 60s. And he wrote this quite interesting essay in Film Studio, like a film magazine that came out of Frankfurt, pretty much straight out of Adorno and Horkheimer's seminars, as it were, in which he makes an interesting distinction in arguing with other people on the political left that he doesn't like. And I want to say those are the people who sort of start becoming the aesthetic left. And he's saying those people are reading too much of the late Adorno and not the culture industry Adorno, etc., but like the aesthetic theory Adorno, right? Like, which is a book that didn't get published in Adorno's lifetime, but a lot of the stuff was, of course, nevertheless available, right? And so Schütte, like, there is an interesting, and this gets really messy and complicated, which I like this, where within the same group, things, sort of split along, like, which text are you reading here and what are you aligning with? And now, not that Adorno was necessarily like, he's not like a ludic, sort of like a playful, perhaps, a philosopher, but he clearly affirms aesthetics in a very, very important way. And I think he does that, and I've had conversations with the New Munich group filmmakers about this, that there is something interesting going on at the time that I haven't mapped out yet, though, I should say, right? I mean, this would be a good part of the book to reconstruct some of those arguments, but paying close attention to the relatively small theoretical differences that I think are actually quite symptomatic and significant differences. So, as that.
Well, first of all, I mean, thank you so much. This is it's such a layered talk, and philosophically also very grounded. I don't know the film, but I just wanted to ask you how you define joy, because this is something that comes up very often, and I'm wondering if you or aesthetic. If you define joy in an aesthetic sense, it sort of takes me to the idea, the Kantian aesthetic of kind of Wohlgefallen, where, of course, the idea of play is also very dominant. I mean, not only in Kant, but before him in Schiller. So in aesthetic judgment, reason does not really play much of a role. I mean, it's the play drive in aesthetics that negotiates between the epistemic or the way you're using joy, because you have also brought in the notion of free play, which is, of course, very Kantian, and later we see it in Derrida too, if you're using it in that sense. But then, in a way, if this joy overcomes reason in some way, maybe it even moves towards the sublime. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you were, going to take it in that direction. Mm-hmm. But I also want to say that I appreciate very much the idea of Rettungskritik here, of the film, because it's such a Benjaminian ploy or playbook of let's actually save these, kind of forgotten works of art because they're very prescient in a certain sense. Yeah. So basically, because there was so much terminology here, the joy in violence, and is the joy in violence synonymous with freedom, breaking rules, and so on and so forth? So if you could just
Yeah, thanks, Azadeh. That's a rich question. The short answer to your question is Spinoza. So, and I've written along those lines about, and again, it's not surprising. I mean, I said explicitly sort of that Deleuze is an important thinker for me, and Spinoza is very important for Deleuze, and Spinoza's notion of joy, which is the theory of affect, comes straight out of Spinoza ultimately. So there's a certain immanent understanding of joy that's not tied to violence in the same sense. So I would have to think, my inclination is to say, no, I don't want to go down the Kantian road of the sublime. If anything, I would go down the road of the beautiful, not the sublime, I think. But that's at least not for me in my own thinking the resonance here. And truth be told, I've given a version of this paper before at a conference that was called The Joy of Violence. And so that's sort of where I sort of put a few things together for me. But maybe one way of addressing this question is again sort of by way of sort of self-critique, or simply to be clear about why I'm not sure it will work. Those of you who do political theory know that some of these connections that I'm making, including some of the inflections that I'm making, are controversial, let's put it this way, right? To put Adorno and Deleuze together, or they don't all go, or Rancière and Foucault, they are not all the same, and I know that. But I am operating from the notion that theory is a toolbox, and you do things with it, right? And so, the example would be that, you don't use the hammer all the time, right? It depends on what you need to do, right? And so theories are there to be used. That doesn't mean you completely falsify them, and in fact, I don't think that I do. But I'm not necessarily invested in pure fidelity in that sort of straightforward philosophical sense. I think that's actually sort of I don't have very little patience for this. So I'm more interested in to what extent do certain ideas, concepts, allow one to build concepts, right, or to reconfigure concepts, or to reframe concepts, rather than endlessly debating about what any given philosopher meant by something, right? I can have that debate about some philosophers, but I'm not a trained philosopher, so there's a limit there. But there is I'm coming from a sort of investment myself that has to do with I'm cranky when it comes to notions of representation and transcendence and sort of an outside. To me, this is it is a mistake, and that's sort of where I stand, so to speak. And then the question is well, where do you go from there if there's no outside? Because for the longest time, we tend to think there is an outside, the outside to violence, right? And wouldn't that be nice? Of course, right? But what do you do when that's not the case? Right? And this would be the Foucauldian point again, to sort of say it's what we receive as universal and necessary and obligatory is an outcome of all kinds of chance occurrences. And I think if we take this seriously, then then you have to ask certain kind of questions. And then for me the question is always, who can help me think through that a little bit? But I'm not writing a book about Kant or Spinoza or Deleuze, right? It's at certain moments, okay, here are some people who have thought about something like images, right? What are images? Well, I'm saying they're not representations, right? And where do you go when you say an image, first and foremost, doesn't represent anything? It does something before it represents something. Right? And that is a profound philosophical, there's a long philosophical history about this, of course, but there's a pretty significant difference. And if you take that seriously, then you get into some weird uncharted waters, and it's a little bit of an experiment. So, yeah.
Thank you for that talk. I had just one small question, because it remains a question in my head. The initial example or the scene of the dart game, how the woman's body on the dart, how does it replicate itself in the final scene?
In the final scene?
Yes, when the girl goes to the car, right, and rejects him. and then he takes out the gun and shoots the father. How is that a repetition of the earlier scene?
So I would have to think about whether it is a repetition of the earlier scene, but I think what you're getting to is certainly the role that women play in the film, right? Like the violence is done to the image representation, a crude one, of a woman. There are other women in the film, the wife and the stepdaughter, right? Like that's something that I'm not talking about in this paper. And then obviously the daughter rejecting him. And one way that the film has been suggested that rejection, that earlier they have sex and then she starts to basically push him back again, right? Like, and so there's certainly one legitimate way, as far as I'm concerned, of reading the film as saying there is in fact a somewhat cause and effect. And if that's what it is, I think the film would have to be talked to us as not just representing misogyny, but being misogynist, right? I think that's an available reading. Because I'm interested in a somewhat different question, I'm tracing this in a different way, but not necessarily to say that this is not the case as such, right? But
If it drops out, how do you then hold freedom of action in it? If the cause and effect drops out, how do you keep the relationality between action and freedom?
yeah, so like on some level, I want to say that the freedom, right? Like so, I mean, as I said, like on what the film sort of at its most pessimistic suggests is that freedom is the agent of it's emerging as the agent of incarceration, right? And so, if that's the diagnosis that the film provides. Right? And I'm suggesting that that's certainly an argument that Foucault is making, right? Like in his account of neoliberalism, then the categories of freedom and action become highly troubling in the first place. Action is not the thing that gets you to freedom, or freedom is like they are, right? Like there is no such thing as good action in this account and bad action from the get-go, right? Because you don't know, right? Because freedom is no longer the thing that we think it is. It's no longer that outside. It's no longer that, which we probably all want freedom, right? Like so that, but this is precisely not this category anymore. That's where the insidiousness comes in, I think. And so the action, like I think that the film itself and Benno's actions are, in my opinion, unreflective. We don't really see him. He's not out. Like I mean, it's important to understand that this notion of idiotism from Han is not meant to suggest that this person is that this is stupidity. There's a difference for Han between those two, right? But Benno is not offered as a reflective character. He doesn't reflect on his relationships, but he feels them. He senses them. He senses something is wrong, but he can't articulate what that is. That's very clear in the film, which I'm inclined to read as sort of like a symptom of the time in the sense of, we can't actually articulate what it is that's going on, which is why one misses things also, right? Like I wonder what we're missing today when we are continue to talk with the same categories about the presence. I'm not sure that not something is going on at the same time. So I know I'm not getting completely to your question because it's also one that I haven't thought about yet, but sort of maybe one more and then he had a hand up already. We can talk. Yes, right.
It's a very short, very brief question. I was taking you away from the philosophical debates. I mean, I haven't seen this film, and I'm not aware of.
It is available on DVD. Go watch it.
I was reminded of Paolo Pasolini's initial films, where he works with this. I'm forgetting the name of one of these early black and white films, where he works with his favorite actor, whom he discovers in one of the slums near Rome.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And the scenes of boys running, young men running together, teenagers running together, adolescent, the biopolitics, the violent boy biopolitics of adolescent male, community action, if you might put it like this. Do you see shades of Pasolini here?
I don't know. I have seen those early Pasolini films, but I think at least film historically, it's like I suspect that's not the case in a sort of direct influence. though I don't know. I've never seen Schaaf talk about those influences. Schaaf himself comes more from a theater background, right? He made a couple of television films, and then he made this film as his first feature film. Is that correct? And then he made 3 more in his entire career. But he became better known probably as a theater and opera director. So I don't know if he was even aware of those Pasolini films. But what would be interesting is it would be interesting to go back and look at those films and sort of like chart out maybe sort of like this kind of what you just called like male biopolitics of adolescence or something, right? Like, and there could be something interesting in the 60s in European cinema going. I don't know.
Because there is this recording of there's a TV debate in Italian television.
Okay.
Pasolini faces a very similar debate about the aesthetic left
Yeah.
versus the action.
Yes, I know. Yep.
He answers exactly the same critique, and he mirrors
Okay, good. Like I'm grateful that you bring this up. I will for sure. I'm somewhat familiar with this, but like it's a long time that I've read some of Pasolini's stuff also, and but his Poetics of Cinema is of course also one that it does connect again from my interest in Deleuze, of course. I mean, they're sort of I like it. So, all right, I think we should probably call it good. So. Thanks.